Go.
All right. I'll just say again, welcome to the Floyd County Museum. I'm Jay Grosskreitz, the current president of the MMCI Club, and I'm really honored that everybody was able to make it down for a show. We had a really good showing the last 2 days already, and today we'll just have we're waiting for one more past employee. He is in town. He'll be coming here. We'll let him get in here, but we'll get started here. I'm just going to let the guys introduce themselves, maybe where they worked, how long they worked, and maybe what department they worked on and stuff. And we'll just open discussion, and we're going to run it till about 4:30, roughly somewhere in there, so they don't get too long-winded. If they do, I'll cut them off, and hopefully they'll share, and one person won't take the show here. But and we'll leave it open to just questions and stuff too. So I'll let you guys go ahead and start.
Well, I'm Jim Jansen, and I started in 1950 in the sales department in Hopkins. And I worked myself way up until I was Western Regional Manager in after the merger with, I worked till 1990. I put 40 years in. I was in the sales department. And these guys here, they thought I never did anything, but I did. You know, I was the one that collected the money, so we could meet payroll and all that. So anyway, I had quite an experience. My father started in 1924 at the Lake Street plant as a timekeeper, and eventually worked up through Hopkins and was general credit manager for the company. So that's a capsule of how I have got with Minneapolis-Moline.
Almost 100 years in the family.
Yeah.
I'm Mike Verhulst. I started with Minneapolis-Moline in 1968, January of 68, and I stayed there, left in April of 1974 to go back and do the really profitable things, like farming. and that was the year. It was a year too late. But the beans had jumped, a few of them, to $12, and corn was $3 a bushel. That was at the beginning of the year, and in '73, and people had a lot of money, and everything they bid up, everything. Inflation was 25% there for a couple of years, if you remember. Some companies raised their prices like 3 times during the year. Inflation was going so fast. But anyway, that was after I left Moline. I was at Moline. I worked at Hopkins in the engineering department. I worked the first year. I worked primarily on changes to the existing 900 and 1000, and primarily aimed at cost reduction. That was the time the company was trying to get every penny out because the farmers didn't have the money to spend at that time for anything very fancy. Then I worked on the 50 series improvements that were made for the 50 series that were introduced in the late '69. In early '69, I got to go to Arizona with the head of test department and the head of the engineering department, and the head of the engineering department took me along, mainly I think because I was low down, I was the bottom of the ladder in seniority, and he had never driven a tractor before. And he was wanting someone to help educate him and not go back and show everyone and tell everyone what he didn't know. And he did a pretty good job, but we were plowing with it was a G1000 Vista that had the new final drives in it, the new bigger ring and pinion, and the heavier axles, and the new hydraulic system on it. And we were out with a spinner plow on the Arizona ground, which is pretty tough. And we had one of those spinner plows. When you turned around the end, while you're turning, you had to hit the lever both ways to get it to flip over on the one cylinder to plow back and forth. And then you dropped it down on the ground. And if you didn't hit it right on that changeover, it didn't start right, it'd hang up right in the middle. And then you had to get off and tip the plow one way or the other a little bit. Well, first several times he had to get off and tip the plow a little bit. and we made about third or fourth time. We turned at the end, and it got to plow perfect, and throttle wide open and took off. And I'm sitting beside him, tapping him on the back. He forgot to drop the plow. He's not around, so I can tell the story on it now. But anyway, I stayed. I helped develop the 4T concept. I convinced him it was possible to use two-wheel drive components, which the program started not long after that trip. And then I also later worked on the 4150 concept as a smaller tractor using the Oliver components design. But I did a lot of work on the corporate tractor in 1970, in 71, after that split companies back apart after putting them together in 69. I came down and worked product planning for my former boss, who was down here. And then we got moved to, they formed White again in 1972, beginning of 72. And I got moved to Oak Brook in 72. And I did not like the big city. I had a son that loved Chicago, was there 10 years. And he finally decided that wasn't big enough yet. He's now in downtown Manhattan, New York. So he likes crowds and people, not me. But it was an enjoyable time. I farmed with Moline tractors and grew up with them. My father had a JT, and then he bought a 1950 ZA in 1951. It was a carryover in 51, and it was never been out of the family. And my son and I just finished Wednesday getting it painted and put back together. After sitting around parts 8 years, I had to have a few donor tractors here and there where parts had got lost, but we got the job done. And I enjoyed the work. Would have liked to continue to work for a company, but I didn't like Chicago.
Yeah, I'm Dick Jansen. I worked in the test department. Started in October of '65, and in January of '66, as you all know, that was the beginning of what we call the X90, which was the G1000 Vista. I worked there until '73. They'd already announced they were going to close, and an opening came up at Toro, so I left the company and went to Toro. But during my time in test department, I did a lot of work in what they call stress analysis. And we measured stress in the material of most any kind, if you got the right strain gauge on, and calculate that into stress for these guys to make it better. And we can talk about that later this afternoon if you want to hear about it.
Go ahead. You go ahead.
I'm John Meagher. I worked at Moline during the summers while I was going to the University of Minnesota, and in 1960, 61, 62, and 63. Most of the time I was doing all sorts of weird things, some good, some bad. My mother was the industrial nurse at Minneapolis-Moline from 52 to 72, and there was some rough times there, on and off and up and down, laying off and so on. What I did mostly was I painted on the 250 picker sheller and the picker. I did test, did a bunch of stuff, and one time we kind of, I don't know, told you, but the foreman's son and I got the shift from 11 to 7, and what we were doing was sandblasting and prepping. I think they were 20 or 24 foot pull-type swathers that were going up into Canada. And it was the time when you could, you had to look like when you were in the sandblasting pit. It was huge build, maybe 12-foot doors that were, I don't know, 20 feet wide and big enough to put a combine in to paint it or sandblast it. Anyway, we got those in there, and the prep guy, we changed hands because when we were in sandblasting, we had a hose like this, and had to wear a suit like deep sea divers, head and everything, mask and everything because of the dust and so on. We got those painted, and the guy outside could prep 4 or 5, and that's all the room we had. And then got them ready, and then the guy inside was sandblasting, and then we'd pull them out with an electric tow cart and bring the next one in. But we, once in a while, it was late at night, you know, get tired and you sit on the lift truck and go to sleep, and hopefully the foreman didn't come like he did one time, wake you up. But anyway, the interesting thing about those is they were going to Saskatchewan or Alberta, and out in the wheat fields for one dealer, as far as I understood, it was 20, 24, 29, something like that, and they were going to be painted Twin City green with Twin City logo, and that I believe was in 1960. So I don't know where they are, and I didn't know anything about it, but I did see a couple of them that were painted in the paint. If you know what Steiger, the old Steiger tractors, the original Steiger green, that's the color they were. And then I also worked on the there was a really old building, and they used the dip the paint for the plows and the shares and all the parts in this great big tank and it was Minneapolis-Moline red, for the most part, was in there. And the paint came from Minnesota Paints, which is basically Valspar. And Valspar made paints for Minneapolis-Moline forever. Anyway, outside of this old building that was like a 1890s building, that's where I was set up, and we did the W4 and the picker shellers and the pickers and the huskers and out there, and I was on the final tests and put the plates on for the serial numbers and took that down and delivered it every week or every day to the office. And there we put the whether they were set them up and adjust them and check them out and grease them. And that was kind of interesting. They'd either go, if they were on a uni tractor, and the job ticket said they were going out in total, and we'd put or I would put the unit on the uni tractor, or if it was just going to be in the yard or go out later, I'd put it on a carriage, 4-wheel drive or 4-wheel carriage, or if it was going to be a pull type, it went on the 2-wheeled trailer. And one thing about them is they're just 2 pins and a bolt, and you can take them on and put them off. And also worked on the ZO cotton stripper. You didn't know they made cotton strippers in Minnesota, did you? Anyway, they do make them again now. An International Harvester does at Benson, Minnesota, after they get done with their sprayers. But at any rate, that model's, so the interesting thing is that they had a pretty good cotton stripper. And they came through the line, and I was on the outside. When it got wet and rainy, it was not a good place to be because I was outside. So luckily the paint shop was right there. You can go in there. But the thing about that is sometimes they screwed up. And on that one they did. And if you know what a corn picker, 2-row mounted corn picker, or 2-row pull type picker, they got the 2 snapping rolls and the gearbox, and there's grease zerks in the gearbox. Well, they came out to me, and I had to grease them before I checked them out, and I couldn't grease it because there was no access hole. So I called engineering, and they came down, and the line stopped. So I was in really hot water with the guys on the line because they had piecework. And piecework is the company came in and timed the units as they were coming through, and they got that up as long as it was under $6 an hour. And this was back in the 60s. It was okay. But if it got over $6, in other words, if they could put out more units in a certain period of time, then they dropped the price and re-time it. Well, when the line stopped, then the guys on the line got redistributed, and so they went back to day rate. Now, day rate at that time, if I remember right, was $1.08 or $1.09. So you can see I was in kind of hot water with the guys on the line because I cut their pay by quite a bit. Anyway, to make a long story short, it took engineering 5 times. They came back to redo that plate so that there was a hole, access hole, so that you could actually grease the unit. So the 200 or 300, I think it was 300 and some units had gone out on the trains already and were down south, and most of them came all the way back, and they put them out in the boneyard, which was on the south side of the second set of tracks where they loaded them. And that's where they sat. And the next year, which I wasn't working then, it was in 64, it would have been, they came out with, and they changed the number to, I think, the 320. Anyway, and that was, and they didn't sell hardly a unit. So that was the last year that Moline made cotton pickers. And then I also worked in the testing on the brown mules, which was the last of the mules. And at that time, I think it was the second year, they came this, well, like, they were kind of stuffed shirts from Coldwater, Ohio. New idea. And they came through and was looking at this and that and the other thing. Anyway, they ended up buying the uni line and then all of the equipment too that went with it. And then the last year, that last 2 years, another guy and I, he was my boss, worked on testing and final inspection of the uni tractors and putting the tags on, or the plates on the tractors and so on, checking that they weren't, I think it was 1650 they have a unit on the unis that it's a variable speed, but it's 2 sheaves that come together in 1650 on the high end. But the last of those, there was a couple of them that came through, and then we had to tag them. New idea, Coldwater, Ohio, manufactured by Minneapolis-Moline. And the last couple were gray color. And after that, they moved all of that stuff to Coldwater, Ohio, I guess. But the engines, the 206 engines and stuff, came from the factory in Minneapolis. That's where they assembled the engines. And I remember a few times we had to stop because they didn't have the engines to put in the uni tractors at that time. And anyway, then the uni, I also worked on a few other things, but I guess I said enough.
I'm Dean Tjaden. I'm a local resident here in Charles City, but I'm not part of the Minneapolis-Moline clan. I started with, but I worked with a lot of the Minneapolis-Moline products. I started fresh out of college for White Farm, at that time it was called, in 1974 in the service department. My goal was not to come back to Charles City after graduating. You know, the only view you want of home is the view in the rear view mirror. But I'd interviewed up at Hopkins and they had referred me down to Charles City he said, you might fit what Max Handley was a general service manager, was looking for. And his contemporaries, in other words, the people that reported to him was Irv Ockelberg. I don't know if any of you remember that name. He was a tractor service manager. Les Kudel was a technical service rep. I worked with him very closely. Anyway, when I got hired, basically I lived out of a suitcase and traveled for him as working out of the plant as what they called a technical service trainee. And one of my first assignments was working for Dwayne Starr and Jim out in Nebraska to take Rudy Volkman's place, who was a field service rep. He had survived the Batam Death March in Japan there, and he was going back in for surgery. So they gave me his car, and here you go, guy, turn it loose, break a leg. And so I did that for a number of months and came back to the plant, was working out of the plant in the technical service department. And our job was basically as a liaison between the branch offices and engineering and manufacturing. If there was a problem, where is the problem at? Is it something in the design of the product, or is it something in the way it's manufactured? And so we would, and then also put on service schools, that type of thing. And again, I can relate to your cold water situation very closely there. I was stayed in that position. They'd always wanted you to move. White Farm, Minneapolis-Moline, Oliver, I think they're all the same. You get good at a job, first thing you say is, you got to move. We want you in Chicago, or we want you in Kansas City. And I was tied quite closely to a farming operation with my brother out north of town here. And we decided, I said, no, I'm not moving. Well, you'd lose your job pretty soon, they'd call you back in another position. And so I transferred to a lot of different departments within the plant. I worked in I enjoyed that job as service rep for a number of years. But then I was asked to go into experimental or service engineering or the engineering department, and I took test tractors out to the Nebraska test. That was one of my neatest jobs I had. I thought was I was responsible for testing at the Nebraska test site the 100 series weights, and that was I thought one of the better tractors that White Farm ever made, and did that. Then they asked me to move to Coldwater. No. And so my last position, and one of my corresponding guys is here. He's sitting in the crowd. Where's he at? I don't see him. Dale Ailman. They interviewed me for a job. They said, well, you're going to go. Oh, there he is. He bailed me out more often than not. But we'd like to have you go in as a factory maintenance supervisor. In other words, you'd be over all the maintenance people in the factory. I said, I've never been involved in manufacturing before in my life. I said, the one thing I don't want to do is I don't want to be asked to move. They said, don't worry. You'll never move as long as this plant's in operation. I think what it took us, Dale, 3 years. I was your boss, and they closed the plant down. So, but I can relate to this cold water thing. You know, I was in the experimental department, test and development, when the last tractor in 1988 rolled off the assembly line, and cold water came in and started taking over things, and it was just a sad feeling. We knew the end was probably coming because the cold water people, we called them the picker people. Well, nobody's here.